Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
Living in this neighborhood has turned out to be a far cry from the peaceful life we expected. Instead, it feels like we're under constant surveillance. When my wife and I moved into this quiet suburban community, we were excited about the well-maintained lawns, the community pool, and the promise of a peaceful life. Little did we know that our slice of paradise would soon turn into a nightmare, all thanks to one man, the HOA President, Mr. Harold Finch. It all started when we decided to install a fence around our backyard. We followed all the rules, submitted the plans, and got the green light from the HOA board. The day the contractors arrived, I was feeling pretty good about the whole thing. That is, until I stepped outside to check on their progress and found Mr. Finch standing there, chatting away with the workers as if he owned the place. "Oh, hello there," he called out, waving at me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just checking in on the progress. Looks like they're doing a fine job." I forced a smile and approached him. "Mr. Finch, I appreciate your interest, but this is my property. I'd prefer if you didn't come into my backyard without permission." He looked taken aback for a moment before recovering his composure. Now, I'm just doing my job as HOA President, making sure everything's up to code, you understand." I didn't understand, but I bit my tongue and asked him politely to leave. He did, but not before giving the fence one last critical look. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. 2 days later, I found him in my backyard again, this time with a measuring tape in hand. "Mr. Finch," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I thought I made it clear that you shouldn't be on my property without permission." He had the audacity to look offended. "I'm just double-checking the measurements. We can't have any violations, can we?" I stood my ground this time. "Please leave now, or I'll have to report this to the board." He left, muttering something about incooperative residents under his breath. The third time it happened, I lost my cool. I stormed out into the backyard where Mr. Finch was once again chatting with the fence installers. "That's it," I shouted. "Get off my property right now, or I'm calling the police." Mr. Finch raised his hands in a placating gesture. "No need for that. I'm leaving, but remember, I'm just looking out for the community's best interests." I watched him leave, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. This man was driving me crazy, and it seemed like there was nothing I could do about it. A few weeks later, I decided to have my car detailed in the driveway. I made sure to get permission from the HOA first, not wanting to give Mr. Finch any excuse to bother me. The detailer had just started his work when I heard a familiar voice outside. I groaned inwardly and went to investigate. Sure enough, there was Mr. Finch, leaning against the detailer's van and chatting away. "And make sure you don't let any of that soap run into the storm drains. We have to think about the environment, you know," he was saying as I approached. "Mr. Finch," I said, my patience wearing thin, "is there a problem here?" He turned to me with that same fake smile. "Oh, no problem at all, just giving your detailer some friendly advice. We want to keep our neighborhood looking its best after all." I turned to the detailer, who looked uncomfortable. "Has he been bothering you?" The man shook his head quickly. "No, sir, just talking." I sighed and faced Mr. Finch again. "I appreciate your concern, but I've already cleared this with the HOA. The detailer knows what he's doing. Please let him work in peace." Mr. Finch's smile faltered for a moment before he nodded. Of course. I'll be on my way then. Enjoy your clean car." As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last I'd see of him. I was right. The very next morning I woke up early to the sound of a car idling outside our house. Peering through the blinds, I saw Mr. Finch's sedan parked across the street. He was sitting in the driver's seat, a camera in his hand, snapping photos of our house. That was the last straw. I threw on some clothes and marched outside, not caring that I was still in my slippers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded as I approached his car. Mr. Finch lowered his camera, looking startled. "Oh, good morning. I'm just documenting the new fence installation. Making sure it's in compliance, you know." I could feel my blood pressure rising. "The fence was approved. It's been installed exactly as per the plans. There's no need for you to be taking photos of my property." He had the nerve to look offended. "As HOA President, it's my responsibility to ensure all changes to properties in our community are in line with our regulations. I'm just doing my job." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Mr. Finch, your job does not include harassing residents or invading their privacy. This has gone too far. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the board." He waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, come now, there's no need for that. I'm sure we can work this out like reasonable adults." But I was done being reasonable. I turned on my heel and went back inside to draft my complaint. Later that day, I met with 2 other board members, hoping they'd see reason. They listened to my concerns, nodding sympathetically, but their response left me fuming. "We understand your frustration," said Mrs. Thompson, a kindly-looking woman in her 60s. "But Harold is just very enthusiastic about his role. He means well." Mr. Johnson, a balding man with thick glasses, chimed in. "Yes, and technically he hasn't broken any rules. As president, he does have the right to inspect properties for compliance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're saying there's nothing you can do? He can just continue to harass me and invade my privacy?" They exchanged uncomfortable glances before Mrs. Thompson spoke again. "We'll have a word with him. Ask him to be more considerate. But this is really more of a personal issue between you and Harold. The HOA can't get involved in personal disputes." I left the meeting feeling defeated and angry. It seemed like Mr. Finch had free rein to do whatever he wanted, and nobody was willing to stand up to him. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Finch's behavior only got worse. He'd drive by our house multiple times a day, always slowing down to peer at our property. If I was outside doing yard work, he'd stop to offer helpful suggestions that sounded more like criticisms. He even had the nerve to knock on our door one evening to inform us that our garbage cans were visible from the street, a full day before trash pickup. My wife and I were at our wits' end. We'd moved here for peace and quiet, and instead we felt like we were living under constant scrutiny. We started talking about selling the house and moving, but the thought of letting Mr. Finch win made my blood boil. Then, one Saturday morning, everything came to a head. I was in the garage, sorting through some old boxes, when I heard raised voices outside. I stepped out to see Mr. Finch engaged in a heated argument with our next-door neighbor, Tom. "And I'm telling you, that shed is 6 inches taller than regulations allow," Mr. Finch was saying, his face red with anger. Tom, usually a calm and friendly guy, looked ready to explode. "And I'm telling you, it's exactly the height we agreed on in the plans you approved." I walked over, curious about the commotion. "What's going on here?" Mr. Finch turned to me, his eyes gleaming with self-righteousness. "A perfect timing. Perhaps you'd like to join our little discussion about proper adherence to HOA regulations?" Tom shook his head in exasperation. "This maniac thinks my new shed is too tall. He wants me to tear it down and rebuild it." I looked at the shed in question. It looked perfectly fine to me, and I knew Tom had gone through all the proper channels to get it approved. "Mr. Finch," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "didn't you approve Tom's plans for the shed?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Plans on paper are one thing. The actual structure is clearly not in compliance." Tom threw his hands up in frustration. "I followed the plans exactly. I even had a professional contractor do the work." Mr. Finch pulled out a tape measure from his pocket. "Well, let's just see about that, shall we?" As he moved towards the shed, Tom stepped in front of him. "Oh, no, you don't. You're not setting foot on my property. Get out of here before I call the cops." Mr. Finch's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "How dare you? I am the HOA president, and I have every right to inspect." "You have no right," Tom shouted. "You're nothing but a power-hungry bully who gets his kicks from harassing his neighbors." By this point, other neighbors had come out to see what all the fuss was about. Mr. Finch looked around, seemingly realizing for the first time that he had an audience. Now, he said, trying to regain his composure. "Let's not make a scene. I'm simply trying to maintain the standards of our community." That's when I decided I'd had enough. "No, Mr. Finch," I said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "you're not maintaining standards. You're abusing your position and making everyone's lives miserable." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd of neighbors. Mr. Finch looked around, his confidence faltering. I'm just doing my job. The rules are there for a reason." Another neighbor, Jesse from across the street, spoke up. "The rules are there to make our community better, not to give you an excuse to spy on us and nitpick every little thing." More voices joined in, each sharing their own stories of Mr. Finch's overbearing behavior. It was like a dam had broken, and all the frustration and resentment that had been building up came pouring out. Mr. Finch's face went from red to pale as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "Now wait just a minute," he sputtered. "I've only ever acted in the best interests of our community." "By harassing us," I shot back. "By invading our privacy and treating us like criminals in our own homes." The crowd was getting more agitated, and Mr. Finch started to back away towards his car. This is unacceptable behavior. I'll be calling an emergency board meeting to discuss this insubordination." As he fumbled with his car keys, Tom called out, "Why wait? Let's have a community meeting right now. All in favor of removing Mr. Finch as HOA president, raise your hand." A sea of hands went up, mine included. Mr. Finch's jaw dropped as he looked around at the unanimous response. You can't do this," he sputtered. There are procedures, bylaws. We'll follow the procedures, I said firmly. But make no mistake, Mr. Finch, your reign of terror is over. As Mr. Finch sped away in his car, the neighbors began to disperse, many of them stopping to thank Tom and me for standing up to him. There was a palpable sense of relief in the air, as if a great weight had been lifted from our community. In the days that followed, we held a proper community meeting. Mr. Finch didn't show up, but it didn't matter. The vote to remove him as HOA President was unanimous. We elected a new board, one committed to fairness and respect for residents' privacy. It wasn't a perfect solution. We still had to deal with the aftermath of Mr. Finch's tenure, and there were plenty of issues to sort out. But for the first time since we'd moved in, I felt like we were part of a real community, one where neighbors looked out for each other instead of policing each other. As for Mr. Finch, we heard he put his house up for sale not long after the meeting. I can't say I was sorry to see the for sale sign go up in his yard. Wherever he ended up, I just hoped he'd learned a valuable lesson about the difference between leadership and tyranny. Looking back on it all, I realized that sometimes it takes a crisis to bring people together. In standing up to Mr. Finch, we'd not only reclaimed our peace of mind, but also forged stronger bonds with our neighbors. It wasn't the quiet suburban life we'd initially imagined, but in many ways it was better. We'd created a community where people actually talked to each other, looked out for one another, and worked together to solve problems. And if another wannabe dictator ever tried to take over our HOA, well, they'd have to deal with all of us, together. Ask him to provide you copies of his inspection documentation. If it's a permit construction inspection, it should be documented to show if work observed was in or out of compliance. No paperwork. It wasn't a formal inspection, and he had no authority to be there. Like I was told way back when I first started construction inspection, if it isn't written down, it isn't. I had to think on that when I was still wet behind the ears. But I finally understood that if there's no record, for all intents and purposes it did not happen. No record of inspection, no inspection was made. Next time you pull an HOA permit, insert a clause that all inspections will be scheduled no less than X hours in advance, by contacting you or your contractor if you are willing to allow that in writing at the supplied email address, and that written inspection reports shall be submitted no more than 24 hours following the end of the inspection. Present it as a way to save them, you and your contractor, time completing the process correctly, and I bet they go for it. Alternatively, set specific hold points that they are to inspect, same notification process, and that's it. The right to inspect doesn't necessarily mean the right to show up on whatever whim the president feels that day. True, but there's also the factor of some. If he wants to come inspect the fence within his rights, fine. At least pick up the phone and tell the property owner you need to do this, and when you intend to. This is the type of crap my board was trying to pull right after the pandemic wound down. To this day, they're still mistreated, disrespected, and fucked around with as a result. One former board member can't even leave her car outside overnight. Ever since, it's also very common for neighbors to just go bang on their door, unannounced of course, with any issue they have, instead of using normal channels. I wonder where they learned that from.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.